Welcome to Nitemare Narratives, where we softly speak the stories that should keep you awake, but somehow help you fall asleep. Tonight, we're drifting back to 1979, to a quiet California coast where two men stalked their prey, Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, the Toolbox killers. Their van looked like any other, but inside it was it was a chamber of torture. Every detail was planned, every scream expected. This isn't a nightmare from your mind, it's a true one from ours. So close your eyes and listen as we unlock the toolbox. Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker was born on September the 27th, 1940 in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. But his entry into the world offered no hint of the darkness he would one day unleash. His birth was the result of an unplanned pregnancy, and almost immediately his biological parents placed him in an orphanage. A couple from Los Angeles adopted him, and Bittaker was raised as an only child in a middle-class household. His adoptive father worked in the aviation industry, which led to frequent moves. Bittaker described his childhood as uneventful, but court psychologists would later note a deep emotional detachment masked beneath his calm, almost robotic demeanour. From a young age, Bittaker exhibited signs of antisocial behaviour. At 12, he was arrested for shoplifting, and over the years his petty crimes escalated to more serious offences. He was arrested multiple times throughout his teens and 20s for theft, car stealing, hit and runs, and parole violations. In nearly every instance, he would serve short stints in juvenile halls or correctional facilities, only to be released and re-offend. Despite having an IQ of 138, Bittaker never held a job for long. He seemed incapable of forming meaningful relationships or expressing remorse. His criminal record grew, but there were no warning bells loud enough to stop what would eventually happen. Roy Lewis Norris entered the world on February the 5th, 1948, in Greeley, Colorado. His upbringing was darker, more chaotic, and deeply abusive. His parents married solely because of his mother's pregnancy with him. From an early age, Norris was passed between foster homes, sometimes placed with distant relatives, sometimes with strangers. He claimed that several of these households were physically and sexually abusive. At school, he struggled both socially and academically, and by adolescence his behaviour had become erratic and violent. He harboured a deep hatred toward women, which psychologists would later identify as a key driver in his crimes. Norris joined the Navy at 17. It offered him a temporary escape from his past, but the structure and discipline of military life did little to reform his core personality. He served on a tour of duty in Vietnam, though he never saw combat. During his service, his disturbing tendencies began to manifest openly. He sexually assaulted a fellow service member and was discharged on psychological grounds. After returning to civilian life, his crimes escalated rapidly, peeping into windows, stalking women, and eventually committing a violent rape. By his late 20s, Norris was behind bars in a California state prison, facing a future defined by concrete walls and steel bars. It was in 1907 at the California Men's Colony in San Luis Obispo where Bittaker and Norris met. At first glance, they had little in common. Bittaker, the cold intellectual loner, and Norris, the volatile ex-sailor with a history of sexual violence. But they gravitated toward each other quickly, drawn by a shared contempt for societal rules and a fascination with dominance. Their friendship was forged not through typical camaraderie, but through disturbing conversations about power, control, and torture. According to later interviews, they often discussed their fantasies in chilling detail. Both men claimed the conversations were just talk at the time, but their intentions soon revealed themselves as far more sinister. By 1978, both men had been released, Norris on parole and Bittaker for completing a previous sentence. Free men once again, they stayed in touch and began meeting regularly in the San Fernando Valley. They spent their time cruising around in Bittaker's silver 1907 GMC cargo van, which he had purchased shortly after his release. The van had no rear windows and was fitted with a sliding side door, a detail that would later prove tragically significant. Bittaker nicknamed it Murder Mac. It became their mobile hunting ground. Their plan took shape slowly but deliberately. They decided to target teenage girls between the ages of 13 and 19, believing this demographic would be both vulnerable and trusting. They would abduct them, record the assaults, and ultimately kill the victims to ensure silence. The plan wasn't conceived in a single sitting. Rather, it was refined over multiple meetings. They practiced their routine by picking up teenage hitchhikers, some of whom they let go. These dry runs were used to perfect their method. Bittaker would drive, Norris would approach the passenger side, and together they'd lure victims into the van. By February 1979, their preparations were complete. They filled a toolbox with pliers, ice picks, sledgehammers, and duct tape. Rope and coat hangers were stored beneath the rear seats. The van was equipped with a bed and a cooler, making it look innocuous from the outside. To any bystander, it was just another work van, perhaps belonging to a plumber or contractor, but inside, it was a torture chamber on wheels. They also chose a location, an isolated fire road in the San Gabriel Mountains. Bittaker had discovered the spot months earlier during a solo drive. The road was secluded, shielded from view by trees and elevation, and terminated in a dead end. Perfect, he thought. No one would hear the screams. On June 24, 1979, they began their reign of terror. 16-year-old Lucinda Schaefer was walking home from a church event in Redondo Beach. She was bright, disciplined, and careful, not the kind of girl who would accept a ride from strangers. But Bittaker and Norris didn't offer. They forced her in. Norris grabbed her from behind and wrestled her into the van, slamming the door shut as Bittaker sped off. Her screams were muffled by duct tape, her hands bound with speaker wire. For over an hour, the van zigzagged through back roads until they reached the fire road. There, they raped her. Norris claimed he tried to comfort her afterward, but the contradiction between his actions and supposed empathy was grotesque. Bittaker was clinical, methodical. He took Polaroid photos. They debated what to do next. Bittaker wanted to kill her immediately. Norris hesitated. Ultimately, Bittaker strangled her with a wire coat hanger tightened with pliers. They disposed of her body by tossing it over a ravine, believing the animals and elements would erase the evidence. No trace was ever found. Over the next several weeks, their confidence grew. They returned to the same mountain road, repeatedly, often driving around for hours searching for victims. On July 8th, they found 18-year-old Andrea Hall hitchhiking along the Pacific Coast Highway. She accepted a ride willingly, not knowing she was stepping into hell. Once inside, Norris pulled a knife and forced her to comply. They drove her up the mountain. She was assaulted, photographed, and then forced to pose in disturbing ways. Bittaker reportedly asked her to pretend she was enjoying it. After they killed her, again using the wire hanger method, they buried her body in a shallow grave near a stream. This time, they took a souvenir, Andrea's necklace, which Bittaker kept in a locked box in his apartment. Each murder became more brutal, more calculated. The third and fourth victims were 15-year-old Jacqueline Gilliam and 13-year-old Leah Lamp, abducted on September 3rd from a bus stop. The girls were lured into the van with the promise of marijuana and a ride to the beach. Once inside, Bittaker pulled out a fake police badge, claiming to be an undercover officer. When the girls tried to leave, he drove off. They were gagged, bound, and held captive for nearly 2 days in the van. During that time, they were repeatedly raped and tortured. Bittaker recorded the acts on an audio cassette, later played during the trial, to a courtroom that wept openly. One of the girls reportedly begged for her life, pleading with them to stop. Bittaker silenced her with an ice pick through the ear. Norris crushed the other girl's skull with a sledgehammer. Their bodies were thrown off a cliff, weighted down with rocks. To the outside world, there was no indication of who was behind the disappearances. The victims were assumed to be runaways or lost. Police lacked leads. There were no witnesses, no fingerprints, and no bodies recovered. Bittaker and Norris continued to move freely, going to bars, watching TV, even discussing their crimes with a chilling sense of detachment. They viewed what they did as a shared project, a grotesque collaboration between two like-minded predators. By October 1979, they were ready for what they considered their grand finale. But that story would begin on Halloween night, with a girl named Shirley Ledford and a van that had already seen too much blood. October 31st, 1979 began like any other day in Los Angeles. Children dressed in plastic masks and carried buckets of candy. Teenagers flirted in their makeshift costumes, laughing, gathering in parks and corner stores. The streets were alive with celebration, distraction, noise, the kind of noise that lets monsters slip by unnoticed. For Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris, it wasn't a night of candy or costumes, it was opportunity. Shirley Lynette Ledford, 16, was a part-time waitress at a local restaurant in Burbank. She was bright, friendly, and independent, a girl known for her ambition and sense of responsibility. That Halloween, she attended a party after her shift ended. Around midnight, she decided to hitchhike home. Her friends offered her a ride, but she declined. It was something she'd done before. Hitchhiking in Southern California wasn't uncommon, even for young women. The risks were known, but often downplayed. Bittaker and Norris were cruising the streets in the murder Mac, specifically looking for someone to snatch. When they saw Shirley near a gas station, they slowed down. She recognized Bittaker. He'd been to the restaurant where she worked. That familiarity, that false sense of safety, was all it took. She climbed into the van. What followed in the next 2 hours was one of the most brutal crimes in California history. Once the doors closed, Bittaker drove aimlessly while Norris struck. Shirley was gagged and tied, her arms twisted behind her with construction-grade tape. They drove toward the familiar San Gabriel Mountains, but this time they didn't wait to reach the fire road. They started while driving. Bittaker turned on the cassette recorder. The audio, later recovered by investigators, documented over an hour of sustained torture. Shirley was raped by both men, beaten with fists and a hammer, slashed with pliers, and mocked relentlessly. Norris reportedly demanded that she scream louder. Bittaker encouraged it, as if the sound of her agony was entertainment. She was tortured in every sense of the word. Her jaw was broken with a punch. Her screams, captured on tape, were later described by law enforcement as something that would haunt them forever. According to trial transcripts, veteran officers wept openly when they heard it. Eventually, Bittaker strangled her with a coat hanger. Unlike previous victims, they didn't hide her body. They dumped her corpse on a random suburban lawn in Sunland, fully clothed. To the killers, this was a message, a final act of contempt. They wanted the world to find her. They wanted to taunt the police. The next morning, a jogger discovered Shirley's body just past dawn. The scene was surreal. She was positioned almost peacefully, as if laid down with care, but the bruises told a different story. Her injuries were massive and violent. The coroner's report confirmed extensive trauma, blunt force injuries, tearing, internal bleeding. There were signs of torture using common tools, pliers, ice picks, and a hammer. The violence wasn't quick, it was methodical. The LAPD now had a body, finally something physical, but there were no suspects. The killers had left no fingerprints, no DNA, and no one had seen the van that night. For months, Bittaker and Norris had operated in total anonymity, but Shirley's death changed something. The case moved higher up in priority. Detectives began connecting missing persons cases with eerie similarities. Meanwhile, Bittaker and Norris returned to their routines. Bittaker continued working at the machinist shop. He kept souvenirs, Polaroids, earrings, and a tape cassette, locked in a drawer beneath his bed. Norris, on the other hand, grew nervous. He began drinking more. His paranoia grew. He told himself he hadn't done anything wrong, that Bittaker was the real monster. But guilt crept in, and eventually he couldn't hold it in anymore. In November 1979, Norris confided in a man named Joseph Jackson, a former cellmate and friend. Over several conversations, Norris revealed details about the murders. Names, dates, and methods. Jackson listened in disbelief, but took mental notes. He waited until he had enough information, then contacted his attorney, who in turn called the Los Angeles Police Department. Jackson's report triggered a formal investigation. Detectives assigned to the case began cross-referencing the missing persons reports with the timeline Norris had described. The details were specific and aligned too perfectly to ignore. A surveillance operation was launched. Within days, both Bittaker and Norris were arrested on parole violations, while investigators built the case behind the scenes. Norris cracked almost immediately during questioning. He struck a deal with the prosecution, full cooperation in exchange for leniency. What he shared confirmed the worst fears of investigators. He described each abduction, each killing, with horrifying detail. He led detectives to the San Gabriel Mountains, pointing out the precise spots where bodies were dumped. In one ravine, authorities found the skeletal remains of Jackie Gilliam and Leah Lamp. Their bones were scattered, some partially buried, some tangled in brush. Dental records confirmed their identities. Rope was still knotted around one of the skeleton's wrists. Andrea Hall's remains were never recovered. Lucinda Schaefer's body was also never found. But Norris's confession gave law enforcement a clear narrative. Combined with the physical evidence, Polaroid photos, audio tapes, and a stash of souvenirs from the victims, they had enough to charge Bittaker with multiple counts of first-degree murder, kidnapping, rape and torture. The search of Bittaker's apartment revealed even more. In a locked drawer, police found a collection of items: earrings, school IDs, and a stack of photos of teenage girls. Many were undated, most of the girls unidentified. Beneath the drawer was a cassette tape. Investigators listened to it in horror. It was the Halloween night recording, Shirley Ledford's final hours, etched into magnetic tape. Her screams, her cries for help, the mechanical calm of Bittaker's voice, "Scream louder, Shirley," became part of the official case file. News of the arrests broke quickly. The public reacted with fury. Media coverage exploded, dubbed the Toolbox Killers by journalists, named after the collection of tools used in the murders. Bittaker and Norris became symbols of pure evil. The name stuck. Headlines screamed with outrage. People demanded the death penalty. Protesters lined up outside the courthouse. Parents held their children closer. Schools brought in grief counselors. A generation of teenagers who had once felt invincible suddenly understood terror in a new way. Bittaker maintained his innocence at first. He told police he was being framed, that Norris was making it all up to save himself. But the evidence was too strong. At trial, the audio recording was played for the jury. Some jurors had to be excused, others sat frozen. The prosecution presented photographs, coroner reports, Norris's testimony, and fragments of the victim's clothing recovered from the van. Bittaker chose to represent himself at various stages of the pre-trial process, often using the courtroom as a stage for his delusions. He called it entertainment. He was not insane, he was not remorseful, he was indifferent. Norris, in exchange for his cooperation, pled guilty to 4 counts of first-degree murder and 1 count of second-degree murder. He received 45 years to life and was eligible for parole, though it would never come. Bittaker was convicted on all charges. In 1981, he was sentenced to death and sent to San Quentin's death row. When asked for a statement, he smirked and said, "I don't believe in God, so I'm not worried about hell." Despite the sentencing, Bittaker would go on to live for decades behind bars. He filed appeals, made public statements, and occasionally wrote letters to journalists. He was interviewed multiple times, never once expressing genuine remorse. In 2019, at age 79, Lawrence Bittaker died of natural causes in San Quentin State Prison. Roy Norris died of cancer earlier in 2020 in custody. Their deaths brought muted closure. For the families of the victims, there was no celebration, just the quiet ache of a grief that never goes away. The murders had changed them permanently. Some became advocates for victims' rights, others withdrew from public life. A few refused to ever speak to the media again. The case led to significant changes in California's approach to violent sex crimes. Parole protocols were reviewed. The state invested more heavily in task forces to track serial offenders. Schools added new programs warning teens about the dangers of hitchhiking. Shirley Ledford's murder in particular became a turning point, used in law enforcement seminars and criminal psychology programs as a case study in depravity and procedural failure. Even decades later, the echoes of the Toolbox killers can still be felt. In courtrooms, in police academies, in whispered conversations about evil. What Bittaker and Norris did was not random, not born of insanity, but premeditated and sustained. It was evil with intention, planned over months, executed with precision, and committed by men who wore the mask of normalcy, right up until the moment they tore it away. The van is gone. The fire road remains. The photos are sealed. The tape locked in evidence. But for those who lived through the case, for the officers, the jurors, the families, the horror never fully ended. It lingers in memory, a quiet shadow, a nightmare that arrived in daylight. The audio cassette seized from Bittaker's apartment, the one containing Shirley Ledford's final screams, became central to the case. It was unlike anything detectives had encountered before. They listened in controlled small groups. Detectives, prosecutors, medical experts, each person emotionally bracing for what they were about to hear. Seasoned homicide investigators, men and women who had spent their careers handling violence, found themselves deeply shaken. Some left the room, others sat in stunned silence. The recording confirmed not just the brutality of the crime, but also the methodical, almost casual cruelty with which Bittaker and Norris operated. They weren't frenzied or chaotic. Their voices on the tape were calm, precise, even conversational. Shirley's voice, however, was ragged with terror. She begged, she screamed, she cried out for her mother. Every second was preserved. The tape wasn't used to sensationalize the trial. It didn't need to be. It became a necessity, a raw form of truth that captured what words could not. Prosecutor Stephen Kay later described it as the most disturbing piece of evidence he had ever presented. He warned jurors in advance, offering them the option to step out. Some did. Those who stayed would never forget it. Beyond the tape, investigators had to verify and expand on the information provided by Roy Norris. His cooperation was transactional. He had struck a deal, his life in exchange for Bittaker's, but his recollections were detailed and consistent, providing investigators with the timeline, the tools, the disposal sites, and even names of girls they had considered targeting, but ultimately passed on. Norris's descriptions of events matched what little evidence authorities had: items found in the van, pieces of clothing, and the disturbing Polaroids showing victims bound, bruised, and terrified. One of the major challenges investigators faced was identifying the girls in those photos. Some were never matched to reported missing persons cases. Others may have survived abduction attempts, or perhaps were never reported missing at all. The question haunted the task force: were there more victims? Norris claimed there weren't. He insisted they only killed the 5 girls named in his confession, but his history of dishonesty and manipulation made that claim difficult to accept without question. They brought in behavioural analysts, experts from the FBI's nascent behavioural science unit, to review the case files. Profilers noted that the escalation of violence, the careful planning, and the lack of remorse pointed toward the potential for additional victims, either before Lucinda Schaefer or in between the documented murders. But lacking physical evidence, those speculations remained just that. The van itself became a forensic centerpiece. Inside, investigators found rope fibers embedded in the carpet, bloodstains soaked into the wooden flooring near the back doors, a sledgehammer, 2 sets of pliers, a roll of duct tape. The walls had scuff marks consistent with human struggle, scrapes, handprints, boot smears. The bed was stained. Hidden beneath it, they found a box containing keepsakes, jewellery, school ID cards, and items so small they might have been missed. A bracelet with a broken clasp, a scrunchie, a partial driver's licence. All of it went into evidence, each piece marked with care, documented in thick binders that would soon fill entire cabinets. The district attorney's office worked closely with investigators to construct a timeline so airtight, so detailed, that Bittaker's defence would have no room to manoeuvre. But Bittaker was not an ordinary defendant. He refused to show fear. In interviews, he acted amused by the attention. He smiled in his mugshot, eyes wide with feigned curiosity, as if daring the world to look away. While Norris crumbled into cooperation, Bittaker performed. He gave interviews. He filed lawsuits from his cell, dozens of them, arguing about prison conditions, access to media, even the quality of food. He sent handwritten letters to journalists, sometimes signed with a flourish, occasionally including doodles in the margins. His narcissism was unfiltered. In one letter, he referred to the trial as a grotesque circus and claimed that the state was turning him into a scapegoat for society's moral failures. He denied the murders outright, despite the evidence. When confronted with the photographs and recordings, he dismissed them as taken out of context. To the public, he was the epitome of calculated evil, a man who could hurt, torture, and kill without the faintest twinge of guilt. His trial began in January 1981 and would last for several months. The courtroom was tightly controlled, with increased security and limited seating. Media requests flooded in, and reporters from across the country gathered to cover the proceedings. The prosecution's strategy was simple. Let the evidence speak, and it did. Jurors were shown photographs of the victims, some taken while they were alive, others after. They heard testimony from pathologists detailing the extent of the injuries. They listened to the chilling audio of Shirley Ledford's murder. They heard from Roy Norris, who described in exacting detail how each girl was abducted, assaulted, and disposed of. The van was brought into evidence and parked outside the courthouse, a hulking, rusting monument to cruelty. For days, the courtroom held its breath as each piece of testimony unfolded. Families of the victims sat in the front rows, flanked by grief counsellors. Some couldn't bear to hear it all and left midway. Others stayed through every moment, clenching tissues, jaws tight with rage. The defence had little ground to stand on. They argued that Norris was the true mastermind and that Bittaker was merely present, perhaps even a reluctant participant. But the evidence contradicted that at every turn. Bittaker's handwriting appeared in planning notes. His fingerprints were on the cassette recorder. His voice unmistakable on the tape. His photographs posed, cruel, deliberate. The jury returned with a verdict after deliberating for just 3 days. Bittaker was found guilty on all counts: 5 murders, multiple kidnappings, rape, torture, and the use of a deadly weapon. The sentencing phase was brief. The jury recommended the death penalty. Bittaker showed no emotion. He nodded, smirked, and asked the bailiff for a glass of water. He was sent to San Quentin State Prison, where he would remain on death row for the rest of his life. As for Roy Norris, he was transferred to a medium security facility after his sentencing. Despite the horror of his crimes, he had escaped the death penalty by cooperating with the state. He spent his remaining years largely in silence, occasionally responding to letters from criminologists or students researching the case. In one such letter, he wrote, "I deserve to die, but I didn't want to die alone." He died of natural causes in 2020, still imprisoned. The aftermath of the Toolbox killer's crimes extended far beyond courtrooms and prison walls. In Redondo Beach, Burbank, and across Los Angeles County, the community had to heal from something it couldn't quite comprehend. Hitchhiking, once considered a rite of passage or a casual risk, virtually disappeared in Southern California. Parents who once trusted the streets now warned their children with sharper urgency. Stranger danger wasn't just a cautionary tale. It had a name, a face, a van. Local schools initiated new safety programs. Advocacy groups formed around victims' families. Some of those families launched scholarships in their daughters' names. Others retreated from public life entirely, devastated in ways that no amount of time could repair. The scars were deep, personal, permanent. Law enforcement agencies across the state reviewed how parolees like Bittaker and Norris had slipped through the cracks. Questions were raised about supervision, psychological evaluations, and early release policies. The governor's office issued a statement acknowledging the systemic failure and pledged to improve oversight. New policies were implemented regarding the classification of violent offenders, especially those with sexual crimes in their histories. And yet, for all the procedural changes, nothing could undo what had already been done. For the officers who had worked the case, the images and sounds remained burned into memory. Some retired early, others continued working, their worldview forever altered. The case became a part of criminal justice curriculum, a case study in how evil can hide behind the mundane. Psychology students analysed it. Documentaries aired, articles were written, books were published. The names Bittaker and Norris became synonymous with horror. And still, for all the notoriety, all the ink spilled and analysis poured over their motives and methods, the simple truth remained. 5 girls were gone. Their lives, their futures, their potential taken. Not because of a system failure alone, but because 2 men chose to inflict suffering for pleasure. The case's legacy wasn't just one of terror. It was a brutal mirror, showing what can happen when cruelty goes unchecked, when red flags are ignored, and when monsters are allowed to walk free among us. The evidence was sealed, the tape locked away, the van eventually dismantled and destroyed. But the fear lived on, quiet and enduring, like footsteps echoing in an empty hallway. A lesson in vigilance, a reminder that evil doesn't always wear a mask. It sometimes smiles from across the diner counter and asks if you need a ride home. The case had concluded in the legal sense, verdicts handed down, sentences finalised. But in the minds of those closest to the victims, finality was a fiction. For families, detectives, and even journalists who had followed the case from the beginning, the emotional residue lingered. There was no release, only a persistent throb of grief and disbelief. The rawness did not fade with time. It simply changed shape. Detective Paul Bynum, who had helped uncover the remains of Jackie Gilliam and Leah Lamp in the San Gabriel Mountains, found himself replaying scenes in his head months after the trial had ended. He had joined the force believing in justice, in the process of solving crimes to restore order. But this case had broken the frame. The things he had seen, the photos, the audio, the mountain soil littered with bone fragments, refused to remain locked in the file cabinets where they were stored. Bynum wasn't the only one struggling to make peace with the outcome. Prosecutor Stephen Kay, too, found the echoes of the courtroom difficult to escape. Though the convictions were airtight and the sentences exacted what the public believed was justice, there was no undoing the years of freedom that Bittaker and Norris had enjoyed, while their victims lay forgotten on a remote hillside. The question he kept returning to wasn't just how they had committed such crimes, but how they had evaded notice for so long. Both men had been out on parole. Both had histories riddled with violent behaviour, failed psychological evaluations, and clear red flags. Bittaker's prison records showed a manipulative personality with no capacity for remorse. Norris had already served time for violent sexual assaults before joining forces with Bittaker, yet they walked freely among the public, blending in. They went unnoticed, undetected, their crimes unconnected. The public narrative had taken root. 2 monsters had committed unspeakable acts, had been caught, and would now rot in prison. But for those tasked with examining the deeper layers, the failures of the system loomed large. In the years following the trial, multiple internal reviews were launched by the California Department of Corrections. Reports circulated among government offices outlining procedural flaws in how parole decisions were made. One memo pointed out that Bittaker, despite his extensive criminal record, had never been classified as a high-risk offender. The parole board had relied on surface-level behaviour, good conduct, completion of vocational training, and an absence of recent disciplinary reports, rather than deeper psychological evaluations. Roy Norris, likewise, had been flagged by prison psychiatrists multiple times for aggressive sexual ideation and fantasies involving teenage girls. But those warnings had been insufficiently emphasised during his parole hearings. His cooperation during his final incarceration and the lack of new violent incidents in prison had given officials the impression he had stabilised. Reforms began slowly. Legislation was proposed that would mandate thorough psychiatric re-evaluations for all sex offenders prior to parole consideration. Risk assessment tools were updated, files were digitised, and an offender tracking system was introduced to monitor high-risk individuals across jurisdictions. But these improvements were reactive, spurred by the horror that had already occurred. The victims' families became de facto advocates. Some channeled their grief into activism. The parents of Lucinda Schaefer partnered with victims' rights groups to push for mandatory notification of parole hearings. Shirley Ledford's mother began speaking at high schools about the dangers of hitchhiking and predatory behaviour. She never used graphic details, just quiet, urgent warnings drawn from personal loss. Her presence alone was enough. Over time, the community that had once recoiled in horror began to mobilise around remembrance. Memorial services were held in churches, schools and parks. Trees were planted in the names of the girls. Murals appeared on local walls, their faces painted with care, bright, full of life, frozen in the innocence that had been stolen. But even as these tributes emerged, reminders of the case remained in circulation. The tape, though never released publicly, had become legend in criminal justice circles. It was referenced in training academies, cited in forensic textbooks, and discussed quietly by those who had heard it. The photographs, too, were used sparingly in lectures about the psychology of sadism and offender profiling. They were artifacts of horror, yet necessary tools in understanding how such evil could be both planned and executed by ordinary men. Inside San Quentin, Lawrence Bittaker settled into life on death row with calculated detachment. His cell was stark, no television, no phone privileges, only books and legal papers. He corresponded regularly with people who wrote to him out of morbid fascination. Occasionally, he responded to letters from criminology students or amateur journalists, offering vague musings about his case. He never admitted guilt. He never expressed regret. To some, his behaviour appeared performative, a refusal to cede control, even in captivity. He took pride in knowing the details of his own court record better than most lawyers. He wrote lengthy appeals by hand, challenging technicalities and prison conditions, most of which were dismissed without comment. His name appeared occasionally in local papers, usually in connection with a new filing or a rejected motion. But gradually his relevance faded from public attention. Time dulled the immediacy of his name, even if it never erased the stain. Roy Norris, by contrast, grew quieter with each passing year. He withdrew from media attention almost completely. Housed in a separate facility, he avoided interviews and declined most mail. Prison officials noted that he spent most of his time reading or pacing. He spoke little to other inmates. Those who encountered him said he was expressionless, a man who walked as if waiting for something, though no one knew what. His parole eligibility was reviewed multiple times, and each time it was denied. The transcripts from those hearings contained the same conclusion, The magnitude of his crimes made release inconceivable. Behind the statistics and headlines, the reality of what had occurred continued to shape lives in invisible ways. The young patrol officer who had responded to the call that discovered Shirley Ledford's body eventually left the force, citing PTSD. A crime scene photographer who had documented the van's interior requested reassignment. A juror who served during the Bittaker trial would later tell a local journalist that she stopped sleeping through the night after the verdict. There was no ceremony for these quiet casualties, no memorial for the psychological trauma sustained by those who had tried to bring justice to an injustice too large for language. These were wounds without witnesses, carried silently. And then there were the near victims, those who had unknowingly stood on the edge of an abyss. Over time, a handful of women came forward describing incidents from the summer of 1979 that, in retrospect, now seemed like close calls. One woman recalled being offered a ride by a man in a silver van, who became agitated when she declined. Another described being approached at a convenience store by a man with cold, flat eyes, who lingered too long near her car. These moments had once seemed like minor memories, but after the details of the Toolbox Killers case became public, they crystallized into something else entirely. These women had escaped, not by strength or strategy, but by random chance. A different decision, a slower step, and they might have vanished like the others. The randomness of it was what haunted people most. Bittaker and Norris didn't target based on race, wealth, or background. They didn't know their victims beforehand. They simply looked for opportunity. They struck when they saw vulnerability. There was no pattern beyond convenience, and that made them harder to predict, harder to stop. Their crimes became a defining case in the development of criminal profiling in the late 20th century. FBI analysts dissected their behaviors, catalogued their escalation patterns, and used the findings to train agents in identifying similar offenders. The term organized lust murderer became part of the lexicon. The case was cited in academic papers for decades, an exemplar of sadistic pathology driven by control, not impulse. For all the institutional reforms and academic lessons drawn from the Toolbox Killers case, there remained one undeniable truth: 5 teenage girls were dead, and for each of them, the world had stopped turning on the day they disappeared. Their absence was a fixed point in time, like a light switched off in a hallway no one visited anymore. But the families never stopped remembering. In Lucinda Schaefer's hometown, her church held a service every June in her name. Her parents never moved from their house, despite suggestions to start over somewhere else. In interviews, her mother would say, "This is where Lucinda lived. This is where her room is. She's still with us here." Andrea Hall's younger sister, now a mother herself, started a scholarship fund for girls studying criminal justice. She said it was her way of fighting back against the kind of evil that took her sister. Jackie Gilliam's childhood friend went on to become a trauma counsellor. She never talked about Jackie publicly, but she did tell her patients that she understood grief in ways they might not expect. And Shirley Ledford, whose final screams became the grim signature of the Toolbox Killers case, was buried on a cool November morning, surrounded by classmates, teachers, friends, and strangers who felt like they knew her. Her mother chose not to speak at the funeral. Instead, she held a photo of Shirley, smiling in her waitress uniform, and let the silence speak. Years passed, the headlines faded, but the pain remained, woven into the landscape of a state that had learned too late that monsters don't always hide in shadows. Sometimes they drive a van through suburban streets in broad daylight. The California Institution for Men in Chino was where Roy Norris had first met Lawrence Bittaker in 1977. And ironically, it was into the same correctional system that their paths diverged once justice was served. Though they were now in different facilities, their names were forever linked, etched side by side in files, court records, and media archives. Both men had come through the revolving doors of California's prison system multiple times, but now, for the first time, they weren't expected to leave. Inside San Quentin, Lawrence Bittaker settled into his new reality with unnerving ease. The institution, home to California's death row, was a fortress perched above the San Francisco Bay, its cold walls and steel walkways echoing with the routines of confinement. Yet Bittaker, who had once roamed freely through the streets of Los Angeles in his silver van, seemed unfazed. He spent most of his time writing. Legal motions, personal letters, occasional responses to true crime enthusiasts who wrote to him out of curiosity or obsession. Prison staff described him as articulate and self-contained. He rarely lost his temper. He kept to himself. But there was something else, something beneath the calm exterior, a pervasive lack of remorse. It wasn't that Bittaker denied what he had done. He just didn't seem to care. When asked by a prison psychologist about the victims, his response was blunt. That part's over. That's not what matters now. He saw himself as a figure wronged by the system, not the architect of irreparable harm. Inmate interactions were limited, as they were for all death row prisoners. San Quentin's condemned unit was a world apart, bound by rigid schedules and physical separation. Meals were delivered through slots in metal doors. Yard time was limited and isolated. Visits were tightly controlled, and most prisoners passed years without seeing another living person outside of guards and medical staff. Still, Bittaker managed to maintain a form of presence. He filed more than 40 motions and petitions in his first decade behind bars, most of them technical, almost all denied. He refused interviews from major news networks, claiming they wanted to sensationalize his case, yet he often engaged with small-time writers and students, offering rambling responses to carefully worded questions. In one letter, when asked what drove him to commit the murders, he wrote, "I didn't see it as crime. I saw it as experimentation. The world experiments on us every day. We just don't call it that." It was an answer that baffled the recipient and horrified prosecutors. But it was pure Bittaker, controlled, detached, and deeply disturbing. Roy Norris, meanwhile, had faded into the quiet monotony of the general prison population. His deal with the prosecution had spared him death, but not the weight of memory. He was imprisoned at Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility near San Diego, and though not under the same tight constraints as Bittaker, his existence was no less hollow. He didn't write letters. He didn't grant interviews. He declined requests from documentarians and refused to participate in prison programs. Guards described him as cooperative, if distant. Other inmates kept away. On paper, Norris was eligible for parole, but in practice, every hearing ended the same way. Victim impact statements filled the room. Prosecutors read transcripts. Panels reviewed his record, then denied his release. The parole board's findings never varied. The gravity of the crimes, the brutality, the premeditation, and the irreparable harm to the victims and their families outweigh any signs of rehabilitation. Norris eventually stopped appearing at the hearings altogether, choosing instead to let his attorneys attend on his behalf. The outcomes never changed. In the years that followed the trial, the public conversation around the Toolbox killers shifted from outrage to analysis. True crime books began to reference the case in broader examinations of serial murder. Criminology textbooks included it in sections about sadistic behavior and partnership-based offenses. The FBI's Behavioral Analysis Unit used Bittaker and Norris as examples in their early profiling training programs. The idea of two offenders operating in tandem wasn't new, but Bittaker and Norris represented a particular kind of synergy, one where neither man might have acted alone, but together their pathology fused into something deadly. They were, in many ways, incomplete individuals, Bittaker the calculating mind, Norris the impulsive enabler. The partnership allowed them to act without the normal psychological barriers. Each reinforced the other's worst instincts. Each validated the other's darkest urges. Dr. Eric Hickey, a criminal psychologist who later studied the case in depth, wrote, "They were the embodiment of complementary deviance. Where one might have hesitated, the other pressed forward. Where doubt could have stopped them, mutual approval erased hesitation." This insight wasn't just theoretical. It informed how law enforcement later approached future cases involving dual offenders. From the DC snipers to Karla Homolka and Paul Bernardo in Canada, the lessons of the Toolbox killers left a mark. Still, for all the academic interest and institutional learning, the emotional weight of the crimes remained concentrated in the lives that had been directly touched. The families of the victims faced anniversaries, birthdays, holidays, all marked by absence. Their grief was not performative, it was quiet, enduring. Lucinda Schaefer's parents eventually moved away from the South Bay area, unable to bear the weight of familiar streets. Andrea Hall's sister got married and named her daughter after Andrea, a decision she described as bringing her forward instead of leaving her behind. Leah Lamp's school created a memorial garden in her honour. Jackie Gilliam's mother began attending parole hearings for other victims' families, offering support to strangers bound by a common wound. And Shirley Ledford's mother, perhaps the most visible figure in the public aftermath, spoke rarely, but when she did, her words were direct. There's no such thing as closure. You learn how to live around the pain. You don't get over it. You carry it. She didn't attend Bittaker's appeals. She didn't read the letters he wrote or watch the documentaries that mentioned her daughter's name. Her mission was not revenge, it was remembrance. As the years stretched into decades, the case remained a reference point in California's criminal justice landscape. Each time a death row appeal reached the headlines, reporters revisited Bittaker's name. His continued existence became a subject of debate. Some called for expedited executions. Others argued for the abolition of the death penalty. Politicians invoked the Toolbox killers case as a justification for both sides. Bittaker, for his part, lived longer than anyone expected. His health declined slowly, but he remained lucid. In 2015, he reportedly suffered a mild stroke, after which his legal filings became less frequent. By 2018, he had stopped responding to most correspondence. The following year, on December 13, 2019, the prison issued a short statement. Lawrence Sigmund Bittaker, inmate number B92100, was pronounced deceased at 7:25 p.m. from natural causes in the infirmary at San Quentin State Prison. He was 79 years old. The announcement was brief. No funeral, no memorial. His body was cremated, the ashes unclaimed. There were no tears for Bittaker, no mourning, only a sigh of relief from those who had waited 40 years to see justice come to its quiet conclusion. Roy Norris outlived Bittaker by less than a year. Diagnosed with cancer in 2020, he died in custody on February 24th. He was 72. Like Bittaker, his death was unceremonious, noted only in state records and by a few regional news outlets. Their ends were quiet, anticlimactic. Nothing like the violence they had once inflicted. In the sterile stillness of prison wards, surrounded by fluorescent lights and medical machines, the Toolbox killers faded into history. They left behind no legacies, only trauma. No heirs, only evidence. Their names, once shouted in courtrooms and written in headlines, now appeared only in archives and textbooks. But the void they created remained. In neighbourhoods where the girls had once lived, reminders still stood. A bus stop on the corner, a tree planted near a schoolyard, a bench near the beach where someone once waited for a ride. These ordinary places carried invisible weight, memorials not marked by plaques, but by memory. Each year, on the anniversary of her daughter's death, Shirley Ledford's mother lit a candle and placed it by the window. She didn't invite others. She didn't speak about it. But from the sidewalk, the flicker could be seen. Steady, quiet, unblinking. A small light against the dark. Though Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris were gone, their presence remained. woven into the institutional muscle memory of California's legal system, encoded in procedures and whispered about in police academies. Their names weren't just footnotes in criminal history, they were turning points. The case had been so singular, so grotesque, that it shifted how the state trained officers, assessed sex offenders, and approached the psychology of criminal partnerships. The horrors committed inside that silver van had become an origin story for reform. But beyond the policy and paperwork, there was a more intimate kind of preservation, one carried out not in courtrooms or prisons, but in basements, attics, and storage vaults. Evidence from the case had been sealed long ago. The toolbox, the van's blood-stained carpet samples, the camera, the audio tape, and the photo negatives, all catalogued, stored, and in many cases, never publicly released. Prosecutors and law enforcement officials made the deliberate decision to keep the most graphic materials out of the public sphere, not to protect the reputation of the killers, but to protect the dignity of the victims. Still, researchers and journalists, especially those focused on criminal psychology, continued to push for access to what remained. Some sought the audio, claiming it offered rare insight into sadistic pathology. Others wanted the transcripts, the photographs, even the personal letters written by Whittaker and Norris while they were incarcerated. These requests were mostly denied, and yet the materials existed. They sat in climate-controlled evidence rooms, labelled and shelved, case number A34471. The number alone sent a chill down the spines of those who remembered. Detectives who had long since retired could still recall the moment they first opened that toolbox, the rusted hinges, the smell of motor oil, and something else. Something wrong. Inside were the tools that had given the men their name: a sledgehammer, pliers, ice picks. Implements repurposed from their mundane origins into instruments of torment. Photographic negatives had also been preserved, dozens of them. Some showed the victims before the crimes, posed, smiling awkwardly, unaware of what awaited them. Others showed them bound, terrified, their eyes wide with disbelief. These were not images meant to be seen by the public. They were raw documentation of power being stripped away, one shutter click at a time. Prosecutors had debated whether to enter them into evidence at all, but they'd known that photographs were sometimes the only language that juries couldn't ignore. The tape, however, remained the most disturbing artifact. Its contents were never fully transcribed in the public record. Only select lines were disclosed during the trial. Forensic audio specialists had handled the original cassette with gloves and silence. They sat in isolated rooms, headphones clamped to their ears, and documented the minutes, one by one. When asked later about the experience, one of them simply said, "I will never do another murder case." Even among professionals, there were limits. Over the years, rumours spread. Some claimed that copies of the tape had leaked, that a retired officer had made a duplicate, that bootleg versions circulated in dark corners of the internet. These claims were never substantiated, but the mythos around the recording continued to grow, fed by fear and fascination in equal measure. For the families of the victims, the idea that strangers would seek out such materials was both baffling and enraging. These weren't curiosities, they were records of murder. A scream shouldn't be played for study. A moment of suffering shouldn't be analysed for entertainment. Some family members spoke out publicly, warning the public against glamorising the case. "These aren't stories," one father said during a local news segment. "They're crimes, and those girls were real." And yet the line between fact and fascination had blurred. True crime had become a genre. Documentaries, podcasts, and books fed an audience eager to learn about the darker corners of human behaviour. And the Toolbox Killer's case, with its partnership, methodical planning, and sheer brutality, fit the mould of the cautionary tale. Several documentaries were produced over the years. Most were careful, fact-based, respectful, but others leaned into shock. Some reenacted scenes with actors. One aired an animated dramatisation of the van interior, prompting public backlash. Viewers flooded comment sections, either condemning the content or expressing grim intrigue. The ethical dilemma was simple but unavoidable. How do you tell the truth about evil without giving it a stage? Journalists and filmmakers continued to struggle with that balance. Even those with the best intentions occasionally found themselves tiptoeing into exploitation. Victim advocates called for stricter oversight. They asked that families be consulted before materials were used. Some pushed for new legislation that would restrict access to crime scene media altogether. The broader question remained: what is the role of public memory in the aftermath of atrocity? To answer that, some looked toward the archives. In 1996, a project was launched by the California State Library to catalogue criminal case files of historical significance. The Toolbox killers case was among them. The goal wasn't to glorify, but to preserve for posterity. Researchers wanted to understand how such cases had changed the system, and what had been missed before they happened. The archive included transcripts, legal briefs, letters, and psychological assessments. It also included the parole evaluations of Norris, some of which offered chilling insights. In a 2003 hearing, a psychologist noted, "The subject displays a compartmentalized conscience. He is capable of recognizing right from wrong, but lacks the emotional anchor that binds empathy to behavior. He rationalizes harm as procedural necessity." It was language that had echoed across decades, cold, clinical, but damning. One folder in the archive contained correspondence between the LAPD and local high schools in the months after the arrests. There, among the printed memos and community bulletins, was a note from a school principal to the mother of one of the victims. It read, "We know there is nothing we can say that will undo what happened, but we want you to know that your daughter is remembered, not as a victim, but as a person. We planted a tree in the courtyard this morning. The students placed a ribbon on each branch." That kind of memory, the quiet, rooted kind, had proven more enduring than any newspaper clipping or televised report. Elsewhere, efforts to keep the girls' legacies alive continued quietly. A small scholarship fund, launched in Jackie Gilliam's name, grew over the years through community donations. It provided tuition assistance for first-generation college students in the San Fernando Valley. The application didn't require a GPA, only a letter of intent. Some students who received the scholarship never even knew its origin. They just knew that someone believed in their future. In Redondo Beach, a local artist painted a mural honouring Lucinda Schaefer. It wasn't commissioned or publicly promoted. It simply appeared one day, her face surrounded by doves, painted across the side of an old bookstore. People left flowers beneath it for months afterward. These were the echoes that mattered most, not the names of the men who did the harm, but the quiet resistance of remembering the lives that were taken. As the 2020s unfolded, the Toolbox killers case began to recede from active memory. New crimes filled the headlines. New documentaries were produced about newer cases, and yet every few years, the story resurfaced, especially when discussions turned to parole policy, death row, or the ethics of true crime storytelling. And when it did, there was always a return to the same basic facts. 2 men had plotted the kidnapping, torture, and murder of 5 teenage girls over the span of 5 months in 1979. They had planned it in prison, executed it with disturbing precision, and left behind a trail of pain that stretched across generations. They had called it a project. They had recorded the screams, but they had failed to extinguish the memory. Every letter Bittaker wrote, every transcript Norris signed, every photo developed in that small van, they were all part of a failed attempt to immortalize power. But in the end, what endured wasn't their names or their tools, it was the lives they tried to erase. Shirley, Jackie, Leah, Andrea, Lucinda. The girls were the true record, not the audio tape, not the toolbox, not the headlines. Just 5 names spoken in homes that still set an extra place at the table on holidays. Written in yearbooks with circles drawn around their photos, engraved in plaques at schools. whispered at candlelight vigils, etched on tombstones, carved into memory. 5 names that outlived the men who tried to make them disappear. Long after the courtroom doors had closed and the last motions had been dismissed, the full impact of the Toolbox Killer's crimes continued to unfold in quieter places: universities, police training centres, counselling offices, and living rooms where parents warned their children to never accept rides from strangers. The murders committed in the van Bittaker, named Murder Mac, had travelled beyond their original horror, becoming embedded in the structure of law enforcement education and in the cultural understanding of predatory behaviour. It wasn't just what they did that made them infamous, it was how they did it. The calculated nature of the crimes, the pre-abduction planning, the use of tools designed not for killing, but for extending pain, and the decision to record their actions set the case apart. They had documented their crimes not as trophies, but as affirmations, proof of domination, of control, of power. It was rare, even among serial killers, and in that rarity, law enforcement found both a challenge and an opportunity. In Quantico, Virginia, at the FBI Academy, the Behavioral Analysis Unit had added the Toolbox Killer's case to their curriculum by the mid-1980s. The study wasn't only psychological, it was procedural. Agents in training examined how early intervention could have disrupted the pair. They looked at the administrative blind spots that allowed 2 violent men to be released back into society and pair up, and they studied the mechanics of partnership, how 2 men with different temperaments could develop a shared appetite for suffering. Special Agent Mark Hurst, who trained in 1987, recalled the first time he heard the tape of Shirley Ledford's final moments during a closed seminar. It wasn't required listening, but some chose to hear it anyway, believing it would steel them for the fieldwork ahead. It wasn't just painful, he later said in an interview. It was instructional. You understood after that exactly what evil looks like when it's indifferent. Not everyone agreed with using the tape, even in law enforcement training. Over the years, instructors debated whether its inclusion risked desensitizing agents or whether it crossed a moral line. But ultimately, it remained part of select advanced courses, sealed behind access restrictions and used with careful guidance. Meanwhile, universities teaching criminal psychology and forensic science began to analyze the broader structure of the case. Professors dissected the duo's behavioral patterns, their sociopathy, the progression of violence, and the manipulation of victims. Bittaker and Norris were discussed alongside names like Bundy, Gacy, and Kemper, but there was always a footnote. This case is not for dramatization. This case is about pain. Outside of academic institutions, the ripple effects found more personal channels. Survivors of attempted abductions, who had once doubted their own memories, came forward over the years, wondering if they had crossed paths with Bittaker and Norris during the summer of 1979. One woman, who asked to remain anonymous, recalled being approached outside a laundromat in Torrance by 2 men in a grey van. She said something about their demeanour felt off, and she pretended to take a phone call until they left. She'd thought about the incident often over the years, especially after seeing news coverage of the Toolbox Killer's case. But it wasn't until the mid-90s, during a therapy session, prompted by a separate trauma, that she finally said it out loud. Her therapist helped her submit a report. Though no action could be taken, too much time had passed, and there was no direct evidence, it still became part of the investigative record. Just one more data point in a case that had grown not through speculation, but by survivors daring to look back. These near encounters revealed how many potential victims there might have been. How many times the killers had stalked without striking. Norris had once claimed that they conducted over 20 practice runs before the first murder, during which they would approach girls, engage in small talk, and then drive away. Sometimes they took photos, sometimes they just observed. The actual number of girls they harmed may never be known. This uncertainty drove law enforcement to re-examine cold cases. In the early 2000s, the Los Angeles Sheriff's Department launched a review of unsolved missing persons cases from 1978 to 1980. Analysts cross-referenced those files with Norris's statements and locations logged from Bittaker's van. They found several instances where teenage girls had vanished within a few blocks of where the van had later been spotted. Most of the cases couldn't be linked definitively, but one stood out. 14-year-old Teresa McGuinness disappeared from a bus stop in El Segundo in August 1979. She had no history of running away. Her backpack was found in a nearby trash bin 2 days later, but no other trace of her was ever recovered. The date aligned with one of Norris's practice days, and though he never mentioned her name, a partial Polaroid discovered in the evidence archive showed a girl with features resembling Teresa's. The photo was damaged, torn at the edge, but forensic facial recognition software flagged a high probability match. The family was contacted, the image shown. It was the first time in over 2 decades that anyone had given them a reason to believe Teresa's case might one day be solved. No charges could be brought, both suspects were dead, and the case lacked prosecutable evidence. But for the family, the acknowledgement was something. Closure wasn't possible, but recognition mattered. Her name was added to the known list of possible victims, not officially, not on any documents signed by a judge, but within the hearts of those who carried the weight of unanswered questions. Other families followed, some found connections, most didn't, but the act of remembering itself became its own kind of justice. Public memorials continued, especially around anniversaries. The 40th anniversary of the murders in 2019 brought a renewed wave of media attention. Journalists revisited the case, podcasts retold the story with a new generation of listeners, and victims' names trended on social media for days. The coverage was mixed, some thoughtful, others veering into sensationalism. But what stood out was how often the girls' faces were shown instead of the killers. A shift had taken place. For decades, it had been Bittaker and Norris on every headline, in every documentary screenshot. But now, more and more creators chose to foreground the victims, their school photos, their family interviews, their ambitions. Lucinda, who wanted to be a teacher, Andrea, who dreamed of joining the Peace Corps, Jackie, who loved to sketch animals, Leah, who played piano by ear, Shirley, who wrote poetry and carried a notebook everywhere. By focusing on who they were rather than how they died, the narrative began to change, and so did the community around them. In 2021, a group of artists and volunteers in San Fernando Valley launched an art exhibit titled Voices That Remain. It featured painted portraits, poetry readings, and reconstructed memories based on interviews with friends and family of the victims. Each exhibit space was devoted to one girl, with personal items either donated or recreated, replica school notebooks, favourite books, shoes similar to those they wore. There was no mention of the killers' names anywhere in the gallery, no references to the van, no headlines, just the girls, remembered as individuals, not as victims in a horror story. The exhibit toured throughout Southern California, eventually landing at a university museum where criminal justice and art students worked together to preserve it. One of the curators, herself born a decade after the crimes, said, "This isn't about reopening wounds. It's about closing the narrative where it always should have ended, with them, not the men who took their lives." In this way, the Toolbox Killers case was finally being reframed, not forgotten, not rewritten, but recentered. The lessons for law enforcement remained vital, the psychological profiles still relevant, the court records still taught. But around all of that, a human story was growing louder. It spoke not of murder, but of memory, not of monsters, but of the people they tried to erase. Every year, on the week of June 24th, the day Lucinda Schaefer disappeared, flowers are left at the base of a eucalyptus tree planted in her honour. No plaque, no inscription, just fresh lilies and a ribbon tied around the bark. Some years it's one bouquet, other years 3 or 4, No one ever sees who places them, but someone always remembers. By the early 2000s, the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation, CDCR, had become the epicenter of debate about early release programs, rehabilitation standards, and recidivism forecasting. While the corrections landscape had changed drastically since the 1970s, the case of Bittaker and Norris was still routinely referenced in internal documents, always as a cautionary tale, a miscalculation, a systemic blind spot that turned into an open wound. Lawmakers, especially those aligned with public safety agendas, continued to cite the Toolbox killers in their appeals for stricter sentencing laws. Even as reform movements gained ground in California, seeking to reduce prison overcrowding, reform bail systems, and reintroduce parole for certain non-violent offences, there remained an unshakable line in the sand, drawn by cases like this. No one wanted to be remembered as the official who opened the door for another pair like Bittaker and Norris. In 2005, CDCR initiated a retrospective audit of parole decisions made between 1965 and 1985. The aim was not only academic but structural, meant to uncover patterns in offender outcomes and evaluate the efficacy of risk assessment models used at the time. The audit reviewed hundreds of case files, including those for both Bittaker and Norris. It noted that Norris had been flagged by a prison psychiatrist in 1976 as a high-risk repeat offender with compulsive sexual ideation. That note, however, had not been entered into his main parole packet. Instead, the parole board had seen a brief record of good behaviour and program participation. Bittaker's file showed something equally alarming, a string of juvenile offences that escalated from theft to assault and attempted murder. At no point had a formal psychological evaluation been required for release. His high IQ, ironically, had worked in his favour, listed as a sign of potential rehabilitation. The audit concluded with a stark recommendation. Parole consideration for violent sex offenders must include comprehensive psychological evaluation, risk scoring data, and multi-agency review. The failures of 1978 must not be repeated. Though obvious in hindsight, it became the basis for procedural change. Parole boards began mandating formal forensic evaluations for any offender convicted of a sex crime involving minors. Scoring systems like the Static 99 were introduced to project long-term risk based on past behaviour, criminal history, and underlying psychological factors. It wasn't a perfect system, but it added a crucial layer that had been missing in the 1970s. Meanwhile, within law enforcement agencies across the state, training materials began incorporating the Toolbox Killers case into simulations. Young officers would role-play through hypothetical scenarios modelled after the details of the investigation, learning not only to spot behavioural cues, but also to think through what might be missing from a seemingly routine encounter. One such module involved an officer responding to a report of a suspicious van in a suburban neighbourhood. The van, parked for hours without movement, had no licence plate on the front and darkly tinted rear windows. It was a seemingly innocuous detail unless you knew what to look for. The goal was simple: to train instinct, to instill a sense of thoroughness without paranoia. For those who had worked the original case, it was strange to see the crimes become something teachable, something flattened into curriculum. Detective Paul Bynum, one of the first officers to find remains in the San Gabriel Mountains, later remarked that the case never really left him. It was like stepping into something you weren't supposed to see, something that had waited to be discovered. I remember the exact smell in the air that day. I still do. Bynum had since retired. Many of the original investigators had passed away, but their notes, statements, and reports remained part of the institutional memory. Recruits studying the case today did so from binders that bore the names of officers who had stood at the edge of crime scenes, not knowing what waited in the dirt. In the years following the 40th anniversary, new technological advances reopened parts of the case. Facial recognition software, for instance, was applied to the unidentified photographs found in Bittaker's apartment. The results were mixed. A few identities were confirmed, girls who had encountered the killers but had survived. Their stories came forward, slowly, cautiously, many for the first time. One woman, identified in a faded Polaroid, labelled only P1, had been a runaway from Oregon in 1979. Now in her 50s, she spoke with investigators after being contacted. She remembered getting into a van near a gas station in Long Beach and being offered a soda. The men asked her name, took her picture, then told her they had to meet someone and dropped her off. "I didn't think of it as an escape until I heard the story years later," she said in her interview. But it was exactly that. Her photograph was added to a new case file. Survivors, known but unnamed. For every one of the 5 murdered girls, there may have been others who slipped away, unknown to the system, unaccounted for in the numbers, but real nonetheless. Their stories became a part of the broader picture of how the killers operated, not in isolated bursts of violence, but in a continuous campaign of stalking and experimentation. In a society often defined by the extremes of violence and apathy, these women's testimonies gave shape to the middle ground, those near misses that illuminate the mechanics of survival. They also reminded investigators and educators that the case, though closed, still held layers left unexplored. By 2022, a coalition of legal historians and digital archivists began scanning the case files to create a secure, searchable database for criminal justice scholars. The database included redacted transcripts, forensic reports, psychological evaluations, and even letters written by the killers. It was a delicate process. Every document had to be vetted, anonymized, and approved by surviving family members of the victims. The families, for their part, continued to guide how their daughters were remembered. Several agreed to provide personal letters, diaries, and photographs to be archived in the public history collection, not to sensationalize the case, but to center the lives behind the headlines. Lucinda Schaefer's letters revealed a thoughtful, sensitive teenager who wrote poetry in the margins of her notebooks. Andrea Hall's drawings showed detailed renderings of imagined places, oceanside cliffs, lighthouses, and floating cities. Jackie Gilliam's family submitted her sketchpad filled with cartoon animals and fantasy creatures. Leah Lamp's brother donated her music journal, filled with handwritten piano compositions. Shirley Ledford's mother shared a single photograph, her daughter holding a notebook, smiling, eyes half hidden by wind-blown hair. These personal artifacts, when viewed together, dismantled the idea that the victims were interchangeable. They were not simply statistics. They were not a group. They were individuals, each carrying a life's worth of nuance. The impact of this reframing was not just emotional. It restructured how educational institutions handled true crime. Professors began assigning readings that included both investigative analysis and victim-centered perspectives. Documentaries and podcasts increasingly adopted ethical frameworks, consulting with families and avoiding sensationalist language. Discussions about the case shifted from how they did it to why we didn't stop them, and how we can prevent it from happening again. And in this shift, there was the beginning of something rare in stories like these: accountability. Not only for the men who had committed the crimes, but for the systems that had failed to stop them, for the silence that had once surrounded abuse, for the oversight that had released Norris, for the red flags in Bittaker's file that were never escalated, for the way the public had, for decades, repeated the names of the killers far more often than the girls they'd taken. That balance was beginning to change. It would never be perfect. There would always be people drawn to the morbid details, always those who sought to understand evil by staring directly into it. But even there, amid the shadows, the narrative had started to tilt toward the light. The story now had a counterweight, a record not of screams, but of songs, not of photographs taken in pain, but of pictures returned to their rightful places, framed on walls, carried in wallets, posted on memorial pages. And each year, on the week of Halloween, as the air began to cool and the streets filled with costumes, a quiet moment was held at the foot of the San Gabriel Mountains. A group of volunteers, some retired officers, some relatives, some simply citizens who remembered, hiked a path that led to the fire road where the van had once parked. They didn't speak much. They carried white flowers and small wooden stakes with the names of 5 girls. And when they reached the clearing, they planted them in the earth. Long before it faded into textbook case studies and academic lectures, the Toolbox Killers case gripped California in real time, raw, unfiltered, and horrifying. The investigation had moved fast after Roy Norris confessed, but it was the trial of Lawrence Bittaker in 1981 that seared itself into the public consciousness. The proceedings began in Torrance, California, where community tension was at a breaking point. News of the girls' deaths had already spread across the state, and the arrest of 2 men who had stalked, abducted, tortured and murdered 5 teenage girls, recording one of the crimes in brutal audio, had transformed the case into a moral reckoning. Courtrooms were packed, reporters camped outside, parents who once considered their communities safe now looked over their shoulders when walking to their cars. The district attorney's office assigned veteran prosecutor Stephen Kay to the case. Kay had made his name trying the Charles Manson family murders and understood the delicate balance between prosecuting evil and respecting the victim's humanity. In his opening statements, he didn't lean into theatrics. Instead, he walked the jury through a chain of evidence so tight, so suffocating, that it needed no dramatics. He didn't need to raise his voice. The facts screamed for themselves. Roy Norris had already pleaded guilty and was awaiting sentencing. His cooperation had earned him life in prison rather than a death sentence. But in testifying against Bittaker, he exposed not only the events of each abduction, but the cold logic that framed them. Norris painted a picture of a man who was intelligent, calculated, and utterly devoid of empathy. A man who treated torture as recreation. Norris described how Bittaker had selected the victims based on vulnerability. He told the court about their practice runs, how Bittaker would circle malls and high schools, identifying girls with a predator's precision. He told them about the tape recorder, how Bittaker insisted they document the final moments of their last victim, Shirley Ledford, and he told them about the toolbox. Jurors sat frozen as evidence was introduced piece by piece. The van had been recovered, and forensic analysis had confirmed that the rear interior matched descriptions of the mobile torture chamber. Blood evidence was found, though most had long since dried and degraded. More damning were the photographs, Polaroids taken by Bittaker himself, showing victims bound in positions of terror, their faces etched with panic, their eyes pleading. One by one, they were entered into evidence. They weren't shown to the press. They weren't described in graphic detail during trial reports. But those inside the courtroom saw them. Jurors, families, journalists. Some wept, some stared straight ahead, fists clenched, unable to look. But the centerpiece of the prosecution's case was the tape. The recording of Shirley Ledford's final hours, captured in real time on Halloween night, 1979, was described beforehand by the prosecution. Jurors were warned. They were told they could step out. Some did. Most stayed. When the tape began to play, the courtroom transformed. The once orderly space turned into a place of audible horror. Reporters later wrote that people visibly recoiled. A court clerk covered her ears and wept. One juror broke into sobs. The recording lasted for over 15 minutes, though parts were redacted and muted for discretion. Shirley could be heard pleading for her life. Her voice was hoarse from screaming, her words slurred from trauma. Bittaker could be heard laughing, Norris too. They taunted her, gave her commands, ignored her cries. And then came the silence, cold, unnatural silence, after a final set of screams. When it ended, the room was still. Prosecutor Stephen Kay later said, "I never wanted to play that tape, but I had to. No one would have believed the depth of his cruelty unless they heard it themselves." Bittaker showed no emotion during the playback. He sat still, arms folded, jaw tight. Whether it was a performance of stoicism or the genuine absence of remorse, no one could say, but it had an effect. Whatever doubt may have lingered in the jurors' minds about his role in the murders evaporated that day. The defence tried to suggest that Norris had exaggerated his partner's involvement to save himself, that Bittaker had been present, perhaps even complicit, but not the architect. They argued that the evidence was circumstantial, that without the tape, without Norris's testimony, there would be no murder convictions. But it was a losing argument. The evidence was too overwhelming. The photographs, the van, the recorded voice. The souvenirs found in Bittaker's possession, Shirley Ledford's earrings, Jackie Gilliam's hairbrush, a stack of photographs that included other unidentified girls. His cold responses in police interviews, his refusal to acknowledge the victims at all. The prosecution dismantled every attempt to soften his image. As the trial neared its conclusion, family members of the victims gave impact statements. In quiet voices, they spoke of daughters who were bright, creative, kind, of birthdays that went uncelebrated, of photos left untouched on dressers, of bedrooms that hadn't been changed in years. Shirley Ledford's mother, who had remained silent for much of the proceedings, spoke for less than 2 minutes. Her words were quiet, but cut like glass. "I want him to hear this. You did not take my daughter. You took her body. You never touched her soul. You will never have that." On February 17, 1981, the jury returned with a verdict. Guilty on all counts. 5 murders, multiple kidnappings, rape, sodomy, torture, and use of a deadly weapon. The sentencing phase was swift. The jury recommended death. Bittaker received the sentence with a slight nod. He leaned back in his chair and whispered something to his attorney. He didn't cry. He didn't protest. To the end, he remained as he had always been, cold, unreadable, separate. He was transferred to San Quentin State Prison, to death row. There he would remain for the rest of his life. The trial had done more than convict a killer. It had laid bare the failures of a system that had let 2 dangerous men roam free. It had exposed how intelligence and charm could be used as weapons, how normalcy could be a disguise, and how monsters didn't always lurk in shadows. They often wore the faces of neighbours, co-workers, customers. The impact on the legal system was immediate. California toughened parole regulations. Psychological evaluations for sex offenders were mandated in more detail. Risk assessment tools became standardised. And the public began to understand, in a deeper way, that evil could be meticulous, even methodical. Years later, prosecutors would point to the Bittaker trial as a defining moment in their careers, not just for its brutality, but for its clarity. It was a trial that drew a line. There would be no appeals for sympathy, no second chances, no grey area. The families were left with pain, yes, but they were also left with truth. Unflinching, irreversible, and recorded in the annals of California's legal history. After the trial, the community tried to move forward. Murals were painted, trees were planted, scholarships were created, candles were lit. The victims were not forgotten. And the tape, the one that had captured the crime no words could fully describe, was sealed again, locked away in evidence storage, never played again in court. Only those who had heard it could carry its weight. They did not forget it, but they lived on. What Lawrence Bittaker and Roy Norris did in 1979 should never be forgotten, but not for the sake of fear, and never to glorify their cruelty. We remember this story not because of them, but because of the 5 young lives they tried to erase. Lucinda Schaefer, Andrea Hall, Jackie Gilliam, Leah Lamp, Shirley Ledford. Each one of them was more than a victim. They were daughters, sisters, students, dreamers, and their names, not the names of their killers, deserve to live on. Though justice was served in a courtroom, the real legacy of this case is written in the laws that were changed, the lives that were protected because of what we learned, and the communities that now say, never again. If you've watched until the end, thank you for listening, not just to a story of crime, but to the voices behind it. Stories like this carry weight, and it's our responsibility to carry them carefully, to the families who never stopped remembering, to the investigators who refused to look away, and to the survivors who found the courage to speak. This story is for you. This has been the complete story of the Toolbox Killers. Take care of each other and never forget.